Fluker is Professor Emeritus of Ethical Leadership at Boston University and Dean's Professor of Spirituality, Ethics, and Leadership at Candler School of Theology at Emory University until last month, and now he is with Hartford International University for Religion and Peace. I want to highlight something else before I continue. Dr. Fluker is the recipient of the 2023 Roosevelt 4 Freedom Awards for Freedom. I mean, four people were honored, including prominent politicians like Nancy Pelosi. And so one of those 4 is Dr. Fluker, and he is going to New York next weekend to receive that award. He was born in Dayton, Mississippi, and raised in Chicago, Illinois, where he attended public schools. He received his Master of Divinity from Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary and a PhD degree in social ethics from Boston University. While studying at Boston University, he served as pastor of the historic St. John's Congregational Church in Springfield, Massachusetts, from 1981 to 1986. Since then, he has taught at several universities and colleges, including Dillard University in New Orleans, Vanderbilt Divinity School, Colgate-Rochester Crosser Divinity School, Harvard Divinity School, Princeton Theological Seminary, and Morehouse College. Internationally, Dr. Fluker has taught at the Salzburg Global Seminar in Salzburg, Austria. Also at the University of Cape Town, where he was a distinguished lecturer for the U.S. He was also a distinguished lecturer for the U.S. Embassy in Nigeria, Cape Town, South Africa, China, and India. Through his Walter Earl Fluker and Associates, he has consulted and provided ethical leadership training in diversity and inclusion for an array of organizations, including the Democratic Leadership Council, Goldman Sachs Global Leaders Program, the Tempest School Business at Carnegie Mellon University, the Association of American Colleges and Universities, the Department of Education, the Department of State, the Boys and Girls Clubs of America, and the Congregational Black Workers Foundation. Dr. Fluker is also the editor of the Howard Thurman Papers Project. Among his publications are The Ground Has Shifted, The Black Church in Post-Racial America, Ethical Leadership and the Quest for Character, Civility, and Community, that came out in 2009. Another one, They Looked for a City, Comparative Analysis of the Ideal of Community in the Thought of Howard Thurman and Martin Luther King Jr., 1989. He's also the editor of 5-volume documentary edition of the Papers of Howard Washington Thurman, 2009-2019, and soon to come, at the end of this year, are the Sermons of Howard Thurman, published by Otis. Now let me say just one word about the subject, Howard Thurman. Many do not know that Howard Thurman came through this region at one point. He began his ministry at the First Baptist Church in Roanoke, Virginia, that's Appalachia State, where he was ordained in 1925. Later, in 1955, Thurman returned to this area on a preaching campaign in Bristol, Kingsport, and here in Johnson City. A plaque in his memory is at the corner of East Main and Buffalo Streets in downtown Johnson City. And it reads, quote, "Don't ask what the world needs. Ask what makes you come alive and go do it. Because what the world needs is people who have come alive." Please help me put your hands together to welcome Reverend Dr. Walter Earl, Fluker, who will come after the song.
I'm not the erudite scholar that was portrayed in the introduction. I was sitting there thinking that maybe I should, would someone like to get rid of this right now? Yep. I was thinking that maybe I should change that biographical sketch because it's so many words. I think that's the problem, not just with the church, but with the world. We have so many words, and we often miss what is behind the word. Logoria, they call it in some places, where the words just run into each other. And like T.S. Eliot said, we are in the experience, but we miss the meaning. I'm glad to be here, and I am super delighted that my good friend and colleague, Kip Olia, he reminded me last night that it's Leah. He said, people always mess it up. And that's true. Did I get it right? Close to it. Elolia. Yeah, so we keep on working at it till we get it right. I'd like to just extend my greetings to a few people. A special thanks and acknowledgement to Mr. Adam Dickinson, or is it Dixon? I just found these names, but I make sure I call everybody's name. Human beings crave recognition. They never say it publicly. That's called dysfunctional civility. But they crave recognition. I do. I like it when people call my name. Don't you? What's your name? Oh, okay, good. I was talking to the gentleman behind you. What's your name? That's what I mean, right? We love it. So let's take a moment, and then I'll bore you with all of these words. To the Council of Elders of the Langston Center, the Mayor's Office of Johnson City, the alumni of Langston High School. Are you here? Would you stand, all alums? Amen. Dr. William Greer, the president of Milligan University. Is he here? Dr. Gary Shelby, who is associated with me on Martin Luther King, right? Yeah, it's good to see you, fellow traveler. Dr. Shelby is the Lilly Endowment Director of Emmanuel Seminary's Pathways for Tomorrow's initiative. That's part of the Thriving Congregations grant making, correct? Is that part of it? Fantastic. Lily likes to be recognized too. And to all of you who've taken time out on this Sunday afternoon to come and listen to me talk about Howard Thurman. I'd love to come back again and do some other kind of talking, but this is dedicated to Thurman. Dr. Mills, it's good to see you again. Years ago, I would come to this area for the Tennessee Baptist Association, and among some of the greatest preachers in the country. Just a pleasure to see you again. And remembering a lot of those brothers and sisters. I hope you all have started letting women preach now. Thanks be to God. I begin with two quotes from Howard Thurman. The fact that the first 25 years of my life were spent in Florida and in Georgia has left deep scars in my spirit and has rendered me terribly sensitive to the churning abyss separating white from black. Living outside of the region, I am aware of the national span of racial prejudice and the virus of segregation that undermines the vitality of American life. Nevertheless, a strange necessity has been laid upon me to devote my life to the central concern that transcends the walls that divide and would achieve in literal fact what is experienced as literal truth. Human life is one, and all men, and I would add women, are members of one another. And this insight is spiritual, and it is the hard core of religious experience. This is Howard Thurman, The Luminous Darkness, 1965. In an interview in the early 70s, he tells the interviewer, I didn't have to wait for the revolution. I have never been in search for identity. And I think that all I've ever felt and worked on and believed in was founded in a kind of private, almost unconscious autonomy that did not seek vindication in my environment because it was in me. Although there's a burgeoning interest in Howard Thurman, this has not always been the case. When I established the Howard Thurman Papers Project in 1992, I had black hair. That's what I remember. There was a rather select group of people who knew him and his work, but even among some of them, few hardly grasped his significance as a critical spiritual and theological resource for leaders, church leaders, political leaders, and the like, and activists in the United States and beyond. So I'm happy to introduce to some and to present to others a brief reflection on the legacy of this important figure in American religious and social life. I've been asked to address the theme, African American spirituality and the legacy of Howard Thurman. So, for those who don't know, Howard Thurman was born in Daytona, Florida on November the 18th, 1899. He thought he was born in 1990. Our researchers, when we began this work in the early 90s, discovered his birth statistic. On his birth certificate, there was 1900. But the statistics showed that he was born in 1899. This was curious. When you read Thurman carefully, you discover that his mother forgot his birthday. She worked so hard as a domestic in downtown Daytona day and night after the death of his father at 7 years old that she hardly had time to remember anything. So he was born in 1899, at the turn of the century. For those who are not aware of the turn of the century in the United States of America, at the end of the 19th century, there had been Reconstruction and a movement called Redemption, which pushed back the strides of Reconstruction. And by the turn of the 20th century, there were incredible race riots all over this country. I'm sure it did not reach Appalachia. It just was probably in Georgia and other places. But it was a terrible time. Thurman is born in the middle of this. He was one of the towering religious and intellectual leaders of the 20th century. His life was a long list of firsts. First with plural. He was the first African American to lead a delegation to meet with Mahatma Gandhi in 1936. It was there at that meeting that Gandhi told Thurman and his beloved Sue Bailey Thurman that he believed that the unadulterated message of nonviolence would come to the world through the Afro-American. Thurman was the first African American dean of a major predominantly white university, Boston University. He was the first African American to be invited to write an exegetical exposition in the Interpreter's Bible. All of the Emmanuel people here, you heard those words, right? You know what they mean now, right? Okay, good. He was one of Life magazine's 10 greatest preachers as of 1953, and was the author of 22 books, numerous sermons, articles, essays that are part of the 58,000 documents from which we made our selections as a project for the 5-volume documentary that Kip shared just a moment ago. The dream of community, or what he called the search for common ground, was the defining motif of Thurman's life and thought. His vision of the kinship of all life, including human beings, born out of the particularity of his own personal struggles, and there were many for Thurman as a child, propelled him into the Protestant mainstream as a distinctive interpreter of the church's role in a democratic society. He influenced a younger generation of ethical leaders, black and white and Jewish and Indian. It's just an incredible, I believe a moment ago, your beloved mentioned Rabbi Shachter Shalomi, who was a student of Thurman's. Those who are not familiar with Reform Judaism should know that this was one of the incredible forces of the 20th century in Reform Judaism. He mistook Thurman for the janitor in the basement at Boston University. And lo and behold, in walks one day into the class he was taking the janitor. And they became lifelong friends. He's also influenced leaders in the modern civil rights movement, which I'll speak to in a moment, including Martin Luther King Jr., Pauli Murray, Marion Wright Edelman, Whitney Young, Jesse Jackson, Derek Bell, Vincent Harding, Vernon Jordan, and I can go on and on. They came to Thurman like Nicodemus came to Jesus at night when their hearts were broken. This is my approach this afternoon, and honestly, I won't hold you long. That's what Elizabeth Taylor said to her last husband. I won't hold you long. My approach is to first provide a brief definition of spirituality, because I understand this is going to be a series on spirituality. Am I correct? And also of African American spirituality. Second, I would like to demonstrate how Thurman's distinctive brand of African American spirituality impacted some of the very visible leaders of the civil rights movement. And finally, I would like to briefly reflect on what his rich legacy bequeaths and demands of us. But let us get a few definitions and details about spirituality and African American spirituality out of the way. Y'all good for that? You know, I'm a professor. When I preach, I get down. Boy, I would have run on the end of that song. It would have been clean in here when I finished. Tell her that's the truth. She doesn't know that, does she? But I'm here today as a lecturer. This is a public lecture. And I'm so convinced that the church spends too much time emoting and not thinking. So here's a wonderful opportunity for all of us to just do a little thinking together. What is spirituality? What do we mean by spirituality? That's a new language for many of us. It's kind of slipped into our lexicon. It slid in, and it dominates the landscape. Discussions of spirituality cover a broad and increasingly complex spectrum of beliefs, practices, and approaches within and beyond traditional religious circles. So even in some churches, synagogues, and temples, people still talk about spirituality. Others don't want to hear the word. They close their ears because they've got their clear doctrines and dogma, and spirituality is something foreign. But for our purposes, stay with me, breathe. Spirituality refers to a way or ways of seeking or being in relationship with the other. That other can be a little o, lowercase, or it can be the big O. But it's relational. That's my point. And this other, who is believed to be worthy of reverence and highest devotion. With this definition, my friends, I'm concerned with the other as inclusive of both individuality. You're an individual, right? I like your beard. That's very distinctive. I used to have one, but you know, gray and the long beard, I started looking like Walt Whitman and all these things. But this definition is inclusive of both individuality and community, and conceptions of God as the holy other, the numinous other, the holy, Isaiah in the temple. Oh my God, holy. The other is not impersonal, but intimately related to who I am and who I become. That's a Walter or Fluker definition. For my friend Robert Franklin, he says spirituality refers to a person's sense of identity in relation to other people and that which is conceived as ultimate concern. For the theologians here, you know that was Paul Tillich, right? I can see you nod your head. That was called recognition. So you should nod your head if you... God as ultimate concern. Rooted in spiritual identity, Franklin goes on to say, are a person's fundamental values, moral commitments, and ability to engage in ethical reasoning. Spiritual health is reflected in a person's ability to trust and care for others. In summary, spirituality demands, I'm going to suggest, that we face the other. There's no spirituality, another way to say it, unless I'm willing to face the other, personally and collectively. I cannot pretend to be the proverbial ostrich who buries her head in the sand and pretends that nothing is happening. Because when I do that, I always leave more exposed than is hidden. To face my neighbor is to face my God. I think that's in the Bible. And in facing the other, we are transfigured and transformed and called to the larger quest of building community in the world. You must see me. You must recognize me. In South Africa, they have this term, "Sayubono." It means I see you. I see your humanity. I see you. You have dignity. You deserve respect. I see you. Even the one whom I have deemed to be my enemy, I see you. Emmanuel Levinas, the great Jewish philosopher, says that it's in facing the other which forces upon me an obligation, which exteriorizes my character. You see who I am because of my obligation to you. My character comes forth. Oh, God, I wish I had you all for students. You're not sleepy yet, are you? Okay, good. Levinas says also this is the origin of civil society. It's in facing the other. My God, what have we done in this country? Spirituality is also a discipline that places emphasis on practice. If you're a great tennis player, you know you got to get out there and hump every day, right? If you want that body you've been praying to God for, you know what you got to do, right? Spirituality, therefore, is something that we do. You can stand on the side of the river and contemplate its beauty forever. But unless you get into the water, it's just a flowing stream. Prior to any act of cognition, spirituality has to do with the practical day-to-day encounter with the other being both friend and stranger, comrade and opponent, individual and collective, divine and demonic. It is in its active, dynamic expression, spirituality is life-generating, but it's also disfiguring. When we bump into the other, we're changed. When we face the other. And to face the holy other, I would think, my friends, those of us who believe in some kind of spiritual life or existence, I am disfigured. Part of my transformation. I shouldn't bore you with these other things because I've got to get to African American spirituality, then I've got to get to Thurman. But I did not want to leave you hanging. So right now, if you're starting to get sleepy, just stand up and scream. It's okay. I've taught students all my life, it seems. And at Morehouse College, I developed a practice with the young men. When they were sleepy, I said, stand up, go to the back of the room and just, you can't fall asleep when you're screaming. I know this. Give it a try. We won't laugh at you. It's okay. So 3 things to think about with spirituality. There are formal notions of spirituality that are related to established religions. Like if you're a good Baptist or Anglican, there are just some notions of spirituality that go with that, right? If you're a good Jew, this is Rosh Hashanah, there's some practices, rituals that go with the new year. That's established religion. Secondly, there are informal notions of spirituality that are self-actualized or self-defined by individuals or small groups. Say, let's get together and let's go up to the mountains and let's just meditate on nature. I saw Buddha lying in the tall grass, awaken him with the sound of the divine name. You can do this. Third and final, they're simply philosophical or ethical notions of spirituality related to values or perceived goods, like truth, beauty, justice, and so on. So, what about African American spirituality? I know some people are afraid of black spirituality. Black just drives Americans and some Europeans, but mainly Americans, crazy. It even drives some black people crazy. It's just a marker that is so historically entrenched in all of the awful things that we know already, but cannot, will not, for some reason, reckon with in this nation. It drives us crazy. But I would suggest to you today that black is an empirical reality. I just saw it when you were singing. That was so black, girl. That was so good. Just, better than Campbell's soup. But let's, for the purposes of this group, let's talk about African American spirituality. We begin first with social historical context. I hope I'm helping. I'm not trying to hurt. I'm trying to help. Tell me I'm helping, because I need it. I'm Baptist, That's our practice. They say, yeah, Doc. Say it, Doc. Yeah. Okay, good. We cannot avoid history. We are historical beings. We're produced by history, our culture, and yes, even how we see religion and faith is shaped by history. One cannot begin, therefore, to discuss African American spirituality without pointing to Africa and various configurations of African retentions and beliefs and practices throughout the African diaspora, from brush harbors and swamps where enslaved Africans would secretly meet, pray, sing, shout, and plot. They developed a certain kind of practice and practices. Anybody here apostolic? You're not? Yeah, good. You're sanctified too, filled with the Holy Ghost? And yeah. You got all that? I mean it. So then you know about the ring shout. You don't know that, do you? That's part of apostolic traditions, which in the turn of the 19th, 20th century, the Azusa revival. How many people know about that? In California, on Azusa Street, the Holy Ghost came down and people start speaking in tongues and all of that. Yeah, man. Yeah. It's a deep story. I won't bore you with all of the fine details, but just know a guy named William Seymour was there. And later a bishop, what's his name? That became the head of the Church of God in Christ. Charles Mason, where the temple in Memphis, where King was assassinated, that's all history. But these Africans were present at Azusa, and the fire came down. This spirit possession, you see black people. Remember the Blues Brothers? They were making fun, signifying on blackness, and everybody's just laughing. But black folks be getting down all over the world. They be saying, jazz is anyway, I'm going too far. Stay with this. One cannot begin to discuss African American spirituality without paying attention to what Albert Rabbitoe at Yale University in his book Slave Religion calls syncretism. Can you say that without spitting? Say syncretism. Turn to your neighbor. Say syncretism. Okay, good. Rabbitoe says that what enslaved Africans did while they were hiding away in the bush, the brush harbor, the swamps, these secret meetings away from the gaze of the master, they were blending indigenous African practices with the Christian faith that was being shared with them, often by the slave master's preacher. This is part of what is influencing Thurman. I just want you to know that. His grandma Nancy was an enslaved African on the Mosley plantation in South Carolina and later Georgia. And you know what? He kind of talks about, he says she's the most important influence in all of his life, the schooling and all that other stuff he did. It was Grandma Nancy. He said Grandma Nancy was the anchor person in their family. And she could see things. She was the medicine woman of the community. She was the midwife that gave birth to the babies when they came. When you read Thurman's autobiography, check out Grandma Nancy. She was some kind of person. Well, that's syncretism. They took the materials that were at hand and they refashioned what was given to them into tools for survival and for liberation. Everybody understanding that now before we go down the road together? Just want to make sure we're on the same page. I should stop at what time? 4:15? Okay, good. I didn't tell you all to take up the first 15, 20 minutes, talking and singing. So they refashioned the materials into tools of survival and for liberation. That's syncretism. I want you to understand that. In other words, they were bricoleurs, as the French say. They were handy people. They took the stuff that life gave them and they created what they needed. That's what happened with Christianity. And I know that there are people here who are of different religious backgrounds and creeds and Christians. Some of you are probably white evangelicals. I was a white evangelical once. I was. I went to Trinity College in Deerfield, Illinois. I studied Greek with the masters. And then I got saved. It was a great moment for me. I'm going to run ahead to Thurman, but there's so much here that I don't want you to miss. Thurman's distinctive brand of spirituality is best located within this social and historical perspective that I'm calling syncretism. Thurman's biography is punctuated with the idea that the God of creation is infused throughout God's creation. And this God is also the basis and the resource for the vitality of life itself, which manifests itself in various forms of spiritual meaning and presence. And I'm glad to leave this lecture with you, copywritten and all of that. I don't have a problem. Thurman himself, however, would probably have some is the word truck. He would have some truck with the idea of a black spirituality or an African American spirituality. You should know that. In his 1971 lectures entitled Black Pentecost, Thurman says that the divine is against any form of absoluteness. Whether it's white or black or blue or red or green or yellow, he said there's only one God, and this God is very jealous. That's what he said. Yet, I'd like to argue a little bit with Thurman this afternoon, because there are many places within his life and work that speak definitively to the time and place of his black body as a site for interpretation of divine presence and activity. And I'm speaking from the notes, but not using the notes now because of time. I want you to feel this. Thurman's body was a site for interpretation of God's presence. Like you, right? this body that you have, if you might not believe in God, so it might not matter. But if you're a believer in God and that somehow you are a created being, your body bears witness. It's evidence of the Creator's imprimatur. God's all over you if you're a believer. Now, if you're not a believer, you don't have to take all this in. You just say, oh, yeah, I got that. There's some other things that work for me, and that's okay, too. I don't have a problem with that either. But if you say you believe in creation, the body becomes a sight. Because God is the creator of bodies, I think, of nature, people, and things. This is a persistent, consistent theme in Thurman. God is not finished with creation, he says, and God is not finished with me. His writings, his corpus, is filled with stories and reflections that depict his black body as policed, as chattel, as a thing that makes sounds, he says, but cannot speak and feel. He was cleaning the yard for a white family in Daytona one day, raking the leaves or something, and a beautiful young white daughter ran out in her niceties, and she took a pin from her pinafore, he says, and stuck him. And he turned to her and said, "What is wrong with you?" She said, "It doesn't matter. You can't feel." This was a dangerous memory for Howard Thurman. Or when he was on train rides, traveling through the country, actually, but especially in the Deep South, he would have these encounters with people who would see him on the train. And one little girl once shouted out, "See, Mommy, the zigaboo? There is the zigaboo." These were dangerous memories. So they become a sight. You follow me now, right? You got me? They are a sight for interpretation, analysis on the activity of God, divine presence. What is God doing in this body, which is black, which is a zigaboo, that can't think and feel and speak? It's chattel. That's what enslavement meant, chattel, a thing, property. Thurman spends most of his early writings working through these dangerous memories. So it is no accident that as early as 1928, he's at Spelman College in residence, but also teaching the young men at Morehouse. He was a graduate at Morehouse as well. He lectures on the Negro spirituals. He takes songs like Jacob's Ladder, and he said, "Oh, we're climbing Jacob's ladder. Every round goes higher and higher." He said, "That's like us." You can read this. He actually published these things. Every round goes higher and higher, and then we get knocked back down. Or he would look at a song, an old spiritual. You all would know this song. Nobody in here is really old enough to know this song. Did you ever hear the song, "I keep a inching along like a po inchworm"? No, you haven't heard that. But the enslaved Africans, they had a song that said, "I keep inching along like a po inchworm. Massa Jesus coming by and by." And Thurman said the little earthworm would be, you'd find it on the cotton bulb, and it would be trying to get along, and you knock it off, and it would fall on the ground, it would roll over, but it would keep inching along. The wind would come along and blow it and prevent its progress, but it would keep inching along. And he said the enslaved African looked at that and said, "That's like us. We keep inching along like a po-inch worm. Master Jesus coming by and by." Talking about eschatological redemption. My Lord, my Lord, my Lord. The Negro Spiritual Speaks of Life and Death was published much later, based upon these lectures at Spelman College and Morehouse College. But he delivered these lectures many years later at Harvard University as the Ingersoll Lectures in 1944. Staying there with the body, in this case, the policed body, the enslaved body, as a site of interpretation. I'm going to give you time for a little question and answer, but I'm pushing this. I'm now leaving the slow lane. I'm in the middle lane, and I'm going to go over to the fast lane in a minute. You with me? I know you're listening, so you'll see the switch, right? Thurman's work, long before we heard the word black theology, Thurman was trying to understand the experience of his people, not just in enslavement, but in segregation, Jim Crow and segregation. And most of his published works address these themes. But his spirituality is there. I would like to argue it's African American spirituality, but it's spirituality which has a universal reach. It lays claim on all of us, because all of us, according to Thurman, are one. We just can't wake up long enough to realize that. So in 1949, he released a little book entitled Jesus and the Disinherited. How many have read that book? Good. So Thurman began working on this in the early 30s. You know, the life of a scholar, they don't give us credit, do they? You know, man, we worked so hard on one little idea, and everybody said, boy, are you kidding me? But he starts working. He first talks about this at Boston University, 1935. Good news for the disinherited. He's challenged by a lawyer on his trip to Myanmar, modern-day Myanmar, when he met Gandhi, about how can you be here as a representative of Christianity and you're a dark-skinned person like us? My friend, Mr. Thurman, he said, you are a traitor to your people and all of the colonized people of the world. And Jesus and the Disinherited is his response to this question. In other words, why are you a Christian? Why do you follow Jesus? With all of the hell Europeans have put upon you, you would still trust their God? Even Gandhi asked Thurman, I would have thought your people would have at least become Muslims, because at least in Islam, people are considered equal without skin color. This is a nagging question for Thurman. So in Jesus and the Disinherited, he's trying to respond to this. And his first response is that Jesus was a Jew. That's it. Ring that bell. Hear those bells ringing in Jerusalem. I hear those bells. Oh, ringing them bells. That was for me. That wasn't for you. He was a Jew, Thurman said. And not only was he a Jew, for all of the people who didn't like Jews or wouldn't let Jews come to their schools to lecture, I know that's not true here. But I know that there are some places, I've sat on boards, where Christian boards, I mean where people love Jesus. Man, love Jesus. But when we tried to get a board member who was Jewish, I saw my friends, my colleagues cry, because somehow they thought they were abandoning their faith. So Thurman says Jesus was a Jew. Trying to make that plainer. And he wasn't just a Jew, Thurman says, he was a poor Jew. He was like us. He was poor. He didn't have anything. He didn't even have a place to lay his head. And if he were kicked into a ditch, Thurman said, by a Roman soldier, by the state, he'd be just another Jew in the ditch, kicked there by the Roman state. Well, he goes on and he builds an argument. So don't miss that with Thurman. Don't color it and read through it quickly. He said there are three issues that you're dealing with always if you are oppressed. And it perpetuates your oppression. One is fear. The second is deception. You deceive because you're afraid. You don't tell the truth to your oppressor. You dare not say it to yourself. Because if you say it to your oppressor, there's always the fear of retaliation, of being injured, physically, psychologically, or death. So you deceive. Thurman says, but fear becomes a straitjacket that holds the oppressed in bondage. Deception makes you always unequal to your adversary because you can never speak your truth. But when I dare to be authentic, integrous, I become whole. And I equalize the relationship between myself and the other, no matter how ominous, even with the fear of death. And finally, he says, fear, deception, over time become hatred. And hatred sears itself so deeply into the soul that over time, you not only hate the object of your resentment, you begin to hate yourself. And he says this is poison to the soul. And the only remedy he felt was to become loving like Jesus and to believe that the kingdom of God is already within us. That's such beautiful stuff. So I take some exception to Thurman's rather, I thought, cavalier statement in Black Pentecost. So that's why I said all of that. I think there is such a thing as African American spirituality, and Thurman's legacy that he bequeaths to us is along this line. My last thought, then let's talk. Are y'all still with me? Nobody needs to go to the corner and scream. Okay, I just really don't want you to do that unless you have to. In 1958, Martin Luther King Jr. is in Harlem. He's signing a book entitled Stride Toward Freedom. It's in the fall of the year, I believe October. And a mentally ill woman attacks him with a letter opener. How many remember that or read about it? And it almost pierces his heart. It's close to his lung and aorta, and he's hospitalized. Lerone Bennett, former senior editor of Ebony magazine, says that wherever King traveled, he carried that book, Jesus and the Disinherited, with him. I was with Jesse Jackson 2 weeks ago. He says that King carried the book with him. We know as editors of the Howard Thurman Papers Project that as soon as the book was released, King read it because it shows up in one of his term papers at Crozer Theological Seminary, where he quotes Thurman without credit. You know, King had a habit of doing that. But here in the Harlem Hospital, Thurman says this. One morning in Boston, he was in Boston, and he prefaces it by saying this. He says, sometimes there are strange visitations that come to me. They're like errands from the unconscious. They appear. This is very shamanistic for those who can go there. But, in some churches, you got people who can see things, right? They prophesy over you. They put oil on you. They heal your left foot, all of that. They do that. Well, Thurman had some of this going on. I'm just telling you that. And so he says one morning he sees an image of King. And he's so moved by it that he tells his wife, Sue Bailey Thurman, wherever Martin is, I must go to see him. And he leaves. I interviewed James Earl Massey, a name some of you might know, who is now deceased. James Earl Massey, when he was trying to write a biography on Thurman, says that Thurman actually left that morning, caught a train to New York City, and while he was on the train, the publisher of Harper and Row was on the train, and he just left King's, the publisher of Stride Toward Freedom, had just left King's hospital room. And that's how Thurman found out where he was. The historian in me, the scholar, says, boy, we need to really check that out. However, that was the interview. But Thurman shows up in King's room and he ministers to him. And in an exchange of letters, which I talk about in a little book called Ethical Leadership I published in 2009, there's a series of exchanges. And Thurman recommends two things to King. One is that he needs to be very careful about his staff and those who are working with him. Because Thurman was always concerned for King, as he was for many young leaders, because they got in a lot of trouble. King, in his later life, I don't think it's a secret in America now, got into a lot of trouble. Thurman was concerned at a very early stage of King's career. The second thing was, he said, Martin, you are now part of a movement that is growing so deep and exponentially that soon the movement itself, like a living organism, will submerge you. It will swallow you up. And unless you deepen your channels, you will not be able to carry forth. Thurman, and this is in the letters. There are really a series of 14 letters we've identified between my work and the King Papers Project. This one last letter, I'll save that for the end. Kip, can you help me to remember that I have one last letter I want to comment on? Because this story is fascinating. King, after meditating, Thurman says you need to meditate. He recommends that he extend his convalescence and meditate. King, according to all of his biographers, extends this period in the hospital. And he spends a long time in meditation, reflection, and prayer for the first time in his professional life. And it's interesting to me from this exchange of letters that after King does this deep work, he and Coretta leave in February of the following year, 1959, for India. Before King left for India to study nonviolent resistance, King had a gun. He never used it. They bombed his house. He didn't use it. But most of us, somebody bomb our house, hey, we at least get a folding chair. We've got to do something. He didn't. But after he returns from his pilgrimage, he says, to India, he becomes a full devotee to nonviolent resistance. And this marks the rest of his career. That last letter. And then let's have questions, because I will bore you. Thurman was very concerned about King, as he was many other leaders, some I've mentioned. There's so much correspondence. He was a pastor to activists. Oh my God, don't we need that now? I mean, where do you go when your heart is broken? When the world has done you in, and when you are hating yourself because you're falling apart. Thurman writes King for the last time in 1966 in December. This is just a few months before he publishes Where Do We Go From Here? And later, of course, his assassination is coming soon. He writes him after he sent a donation to King for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. King writes back to thank him for the donation. And Thurman at the end of his note says, "Well, Martin," and he quotes a naturalist, an essayist named Lauren Isley. Some of you might know that name, great essayist. But he says, "Remember, Martin, that those of us who seek treasure at night must leave a drop of blood." Thank you all for listening to me for so long. I hope I didn't bore you. There's a place in hell reserved for people who bore one another. And I thank you.